Welcome back to Strange Resort, the podcast that lurks in the shadows of otherwise sunny vacation destinations. I am your host, George Hatfield, and right now, I'm standing on the deck of a cruise ship on her maiden voyage. She has been christened Callas II. And although I've been on many voyages before, this one has got me feeling a little bit nervous. You see, the original Callas, owned by Paradise Lines, left the ports of Saigon back in 1972. A few days later, a storm swept over the vessel, and the cruise ship sank to the bottom of the sea. Hundreds died. Only a handful survived. So hopefully you won't blame me for feeling a little superstitious about being a passenger on board this nautical sequel. I'm interested in learning about the history of Paradise Lines, but more so I would like to learn about the people who perished on the original Callas. Unfortunately, finding information has not been easy. The ship sank on January 23, 1972, over 50 years ago. The American press did not write very much about the incident. The original boat and its sister are not gigantic floating cities that you see today. There were roughly 200 passengers on the Callas, and nearly all of them hailed from Asia or Europe. The crew were mostly Australian. However, there was one American on board, Dr. Richard Pine, a once promising surgeon who fell from grace. His name had been among the victims of this disaster. The New York Times posted a brief obituary, and then the world moved on. But the Times got it wrong, because I have learned that Richard Pine did not drown at sea. And the not-so-good doctor did not die in the explosion that sank the ship. Instead, as we will learn in today's podcast, there are two types of people when it comes to disasters: those who give up, and those who do whatever it takes to survive. And Dr. Richard Pine was the survivor type. It's January 23rd, 2023, the anniversary of the sinking of the original Callas. And so far, the weather is calm, the sailing is smooth. Callas 1 was built by an Australian company known as Paradise Lines, a family business. They hoped to become a premier fleet in Southeast Asia. Unfortunately, the escalating war in Vietnam did not make that easy. The original route of the ship was a leisurely journey from Saigon to the Philippines to several tiny island villages in the South Pacific, and finally to San Francisco. The destinations are interesting, but not the most exotic or popular of locales. No stops in Fiji or Bora Bora or even Hawaii. Instead, these ports of call seem more like the sorts of islands that might have an offshore account lurking somewhere within. But I will say this, the buffet was world famous back then and now. The Paradise Lines became popular among wealthy patrons who wanted to spend a few weeks at sea eating an abundance of delicacies. And apparently there were other temptations aside from the gastronomic. I've been on board one day and I have already become acquainted with my porter. He told me that back in the 1960s and early 1970s, the Paradise Lines became a favorite form of transportation for up-and-coming drug smugglers. Their most lucrative product? Heroin. Allegedly, low-level drug mules would pick up several kilos of the drug in Cambodia or Vietnam. The port authorities in Saigon would look the other way for a reasonable fee, and then the drugs would be kept on board the Callas, usually hidden in the luggage inside waterproof canisters. Then, somewhere in the San Francisco Bay, before reaching port and customs officials, the canisters would be tossed overboard. A diver would swim down and pick up the narcotics, just as the rest of the passengers were making their way onto the U.S. shore. It makes me wonder if Dr. Pine may have been involved in some sort of operation far more nefarious than simply unnecessary surgery. Long before earning a medical degree, he was known as Richard Pinzetti. Born and raised in New York's Little Italy, he grew up on the streets, playing stickball and getting a paper route as soon as he could learn how to ride a bike. Throughout his childhood into adulthood, he despised his alcoholic father. His parents couldn't afford to send him to college, but Pinzetti was ambitious. He became a football star in high school, winning him a college scholarship. But once there, even though he was a very talented quarterback, he quit football by the end of the first year after winning an academic scholarship, a full ride. He set his sights on a medical degree and let nothing distract him, not his father's death from cancer at the young age of 46, or even his mother's hasty second marriage to a local grocer. And if you've seen movies like Goodfellas or the Godfather series, then you already know that kids with big dreams of wealth can become warped on the streets. Many of his neighbors had ties to organized crime, and by the time he was in the 9th grade, he was running not just a paper route, but he was selling numbers on behalf of a daily lottery run by the mob. In addition to that, he picked up more than a few bad habits.
There was this big dumb Howie Plotsky who was giving Pinzetti a hard time. And the funny thing is, Pinzetti, he was a tough piece of work.
This is Ricky Brazzi, a childhood friend of Richard Pinzetti.
He could have busted this guy in the mouth himself, but he had this thing about his hands. Didn't want to get him hurt.
In high school, a bully constantly picked on Pinzetti, giving him a hard time about how careful Pinzetti was with his hands.
So he makes this proposition that I bust Howie in the mouth.
I reached out via email to some of Pinzetti's fellow med school students. The general consensus, for those who were willing to respond, was that Richard was the sort of person that everyone knew, because if you wanted to place a bet on campus for football or basketball, he was your go-to guy. He was always at parties, but he stayed away from alcohol and drugs. He married young and divorced after only a few years, no children. After medical school, he soon rose to prominence as a skilled surgeon. Perhaps as a final act of rebellion against his father, he changed his name from Pinzetti to Pine. In spite of his success, during his residency, there were rumors that the man now known as Dr. Pine was selling blank prescriptions to his mafia contacts back in the neighborhood. He was doing this at the same time he was opening up his own practice on Park Avenue. Yet there were rumblings that patients were being sent his way, patients that didn't need surgery, but were so hooked on painkillers, they were willing to go under the knife to get their fix. Dr. Pine partnered with a man named Dr. Lowenthal, and they both received kickbacks until, that is, the IRS and then the feds caught wind of these illegal activities. Dr. Pine turned state's evidence. Dr. Lowenthal took his own life. After less than 10 years of practicing medicine, Dr. Pine had avoided jail time, but his license to practice medicine was revoked. By the beginning of the 1970s, his career was in shambles, and so Richard Pine, aka Pinzetti, decided to get away from it all and went on a 3-week vacation to Saigon. Keep in mind that this was 1972, during the middle of the Vietnam War. Given Pine's shady dealings in the past, it is easy to believe that he had become desperate enough to enter the drug trade, not just over-the-counter medicine, but narcotics. It's January 24th, late in the evening, and I have had one too many Mai Tais. The bartender on our cruise seems to be the oldest crew member on Callas 2. He wasn't aboard the original cruise ship during the disaster, but he did seem to know a lot about it.
I was working on the docks when I was just a lad, and I watched ships sail out of port that day for the last time. We lost a lot of good sailors that day, and a good captain.
Does it make you nervous to be on the maiden voyage of the Callas 2?
Not in the slightest. These ships are built so different now.
I asked him if he knew about the fates of the passengers, in particular, an American doctor.
There's a rumor, more of a legend really, that an American bloke took a lifeboat all to himself.
He survived?
That's what they say, that he made it to a deserted island.
To me, this sounds like a phony legend or a delightfully cheesy television show. But then, the bartender claims that Dr. Pine was found by a retired sailor, someone named Homer, a reclusive who lived on the island of Falalop, one of the tiny atolls in Micronesia. Do you have any idea if this Homer person is still alive?
He's long since passed, but I think his wife's still alive. Mrs. Tate, they call her. She runs the only hotel on the island.
This sounds like a wild goose chase, and I am here for it. I can't resist a mystery. And it just so happens that tomorrow we will be in the port of Yap, part of Micronesia. From there, it's just a 117-mile flight to the tiny atoll island known as Falalop. Population 500. It is now January 25th. I have said bon voyage to the Callas 2. I have watched it sail off into the sunset. I have wandered the island known as Yap, and I have spent the day tasting the most amazing seafood Micronesia has to offer. I have heard from the locals that a man named Homer did indeed live in this nearby island known as Falalop. In fact, he and supposedly his wife built what is known as the Falalop Adventure Lodge, the only hotel on this remote little island village. I'm relaxing today because tomorrow I have arranged for an overpriced puddle jump courtesy of the Pacific Missionary Aviation Company, and very soon I will be standing on the beaches of a tiny little island known as Falalop. It's January 26th. That was a very shaky plane ride. I was its only passenger. This is definitely the most remote place I've been to. So far, the locals seem very happy to see a tourist, or maybe they were just mildly surprised or amused or bewildered. There are not many roads on this island, only one, I think. And yet, parked in front of the hotel is a beautiful yellow Jaguar. And since everything is in walking distance, I can't imagine why it is here. I am now standing in front of the Falalop Adventure Lodge. The water is breathtaking here. I'm staring out at the ocean, and about 200 miles to the east, that is where the original Callas ship sank. Not too far from something known as Challenger Deep, the deepest trench in the ocean. odds are the watery remains of Dr. Pine rest down at the bottom. But part of me believes that he survived, and that he never bothered returning to what we call civilization, and that he used the sinking of the Callas as an opportunity to fake his own death. There are plenty of rooms at the Adventure Lodge, and I am welcomed by a woman known only as Mrs. T. I check in with Mrs. T, we chit-chat about the weather, and I ask her if I can take this photo. Then I tell her that I'm looking for the wife of a retired sailor named Homer, and at this point, I start to record our conversation.
Homer wasn't a sailor, and he wasn't my husband. He was my co-pilot and my best friend.
This might seem strange to ask, but did Homer ever rescue an American doctor that was stranded on a desert island?
No.
Oh.
You look like the sort of man who's reached a dead end at the end of a long trip.
I guess I have. I heard about a story that someone found a survivor from the pleasure line ship that had sunk back in the early 70s.
Homer loved to wander from one island to the next. We were sort of explorers. We loved finding anything undiscovered, even if it was just a scratch of rocks pointing out of the sea.
According to Mrs. T, in 1978, Homer spotted a small, rocky island barely 200 feet in length. He went ashore in his dinghy, expecting to find nothing but crabs and gulls. What he found was a skeleton slumped against the rocks. And that skeleton was not intact. Each leg had been severed from the knee down. Each foot was missing. There was still sun-baked, mummified flesh on much of the skeleton, but not on the fingers, and each removed tibia had been cleaned down to smooth bone. Smooth, that is, except for the bite marks, as if a carnivore, perhaps a seal, had stopped by for a snack. And there was another item on the shore, a dilapidated piece of luggage with waterproof containers that held a white powder. Mrs. T says that Homer knew that it was some type of drug and that he tossed it into the ocean. Wow, that is bizarre. It really is. But of course, that may or may not have been the Dr. Richard Pine, and I guess we'll never know.
Oh, we know. There was a lifeboat record book, and the poor man on that island turned it into a sort of a diary. Just a minute, I'll show you.
After she leaves, I wait in the lobby for a few minutes, listening to the waves outside. Then she returns with this. A torn page, weathered by time. Its pencil markings faded, but the words can still be read. January 26. 2 days since the storm washed me up. I paced the island off just this morning. Some island. It is 190 paces wide at its thickest point and 260 paces long from tip to tip. So far as I can tell, there's nothing on it to eat. My name is Richard Pine. This is my diary. If I'm found, when, I can destroy this easily enough. There's no shortage of matches. Matches and heroin. Plenty of both. The words on this page make me feel uneasy, unnerved, and yet I wish there was more. I hand the page back to Mrs. T. Well, thank you so much for showing me this.
I'm sure it'll make a wonderful podcast.
Oh, I didn't know that you knew I was working on a podcast.
You're George Hatfield of Strange Resort. I never miss an episode. You might say I'm your #1 fan.
Flattery goes a long way with me, so when she says that she knows the exact location of this island, I believe her, and when she offers a ride on her sailboat, I don't think twice. Well, yes, thank you. That would be amazing.
We can be there by this afternoon.
Even though you said it was over 100 kilometers away?
I know a shortcut.
It has been less than 3 hours. I'm in Mrs. T's cozy sailboat cabin, and she is at the helm. She seems to know what she is doing, which is good because I know nothing about sailing. But the waves have been mild, the winds have been generous. A little while ago we did enter a bank of fog, but that lasted only a few minutes. It is clear sky now, and here we are. A nameless patch of land, supposedly the final resting place of Richard Pinzetti, aka Dr. Pine. If what Mrs. T has said is true, then it seems that the doctor was in fact attempting to smuggle drugs. I asked her if Homer had recovered more diary entries, and she said that Homer had buried the rest of the pages along with the skeleton. All right, and away we go. Mrs. T is now rowing me to shore. I feel a little like a pirate that is going on a grave-digging expedition, and I have not yet decided if I am actually going to disturb the remains, but I do plan to stay the night on this island. I want to get a glimpse of what it was like for Richard to be stranded here. Mrs. T has taken the dinghy close to shore, so I am jumping into the water, and here I am. I've made it to shore. I'm now waving back to Mrs. T as she makes her way to the boat. She is a little too focused on the oars to bother waving back, and so I'm going to settle in. For a while, I just sit here, trying to imagine what it was like for Richard. Upon arriving, he must have been thankful at first to have found land, but that gratitude would have slowly soured as the days passed without rescue. Before I do anything, I think I'm going to have half of my roast beef sandwich and a South Seas version of Diet Coke. Okay, I'm done with my snack, and I cannot help myself. I want to know what is underneath this pile of rocks. So I set to work. There's all these nooks and crannies underfoot. It's the perfect place to fall and break your neck. It didn't take long. I am now looking at the skull of Dr. Pine, I presume. I feel like I should not have unearthed these remains, but now that I have desecrated this grave, I do not feel so glib about staying the night here. Sitting on what would have been his lap is a waterproof canister, I suppose ideal for smuggling heroin. There are no drugs inside. Instead, I find a leather-bound book, something meant to be for keeping records, lifeboat inspection apparently, but it has been turned into what looks like an ancient journal for a desperate castaway. A few pages in, I find the spot where Homer had torn out the page, the first entry in Richard Pinzetti's diary. The words are faded by decades, but I can still make them out. This seems to be a memoir of sorts, not just lamenting his captivity on this island, but explaining why he pursued medical school, talking about how he feels about his family and his connections to the illegal world that he grew up around. In addition to that, it is a day-to-day account of his brief life on this island. Sun is going down, and I want to get started on building a fire, if I remember my Boy Scout skills. But first, I'm going to read a few entries right now. January 27. The boat drifted away last night and sank in about 10 feet of water off the north side of the island. Who gives a rip? The bottom was like Swiss cheese after coming over the reef anyway. I'd already taken off anything that was worth taking. 4 gallons of water, a sewing kit, a first aid kit, this book I'm writing in, 2 knives, 1 dull and 1 fairly sharp, 1 combination fork and spoon. I'll use them when I eat my supper tonight. Roast rock, ha ha. I'm going to get out of this. Make no mistake about it. I am going to get out of this. When I was making my inventory, I forgot one thing. 2 kilos of pure heroin, worth about $350,000, New York street value. Here, it's worth El Zilcho. Sort of funny, isn't it? $350,000 back in the early 70s would be worth about $2.5 million today. Which makes me wonder if Homer really did throw the heroin away, because that adventure lodge was probably about $2.5 million worth of property. Back in the journal on January 28th, back in 1972, he writes about pelting a seagull with a rock. It's his first chance at food since landing on the island. The days pass, and he manages to kill a second gull. He eats every bit of it, raw. On February 1st, 1972, Richard spots an airplane overhead. While trying to flag it down, he stumbles. His foot falls into one of those holes in the rocks, and he fractures his ankle. Here's what he writes on the 2nd of February. My foot throbs constantly. There is swelling still, an ominous discoloration around the double break. Discoloration seems to have advanced. I have begun to think I may have to amputate. Ugh. It is getting dark now, and it is time for me to make a fire. Despite my curiosity, I need a break from this diary. Offshore, I can see Mrs. T standing on the deck of her sailboat. I can even smell a hint of coffee wafting in the breeze, and there is music playing. A welcome reminder of civilization and culture just a stone's throw away. February 3rd and 4th. It looks like here to avoid the risk of infection or gangrene, Pine decides that he will definitely need to perform surgery on himself. And he is planning to use the heroin as a painkiller. Here on February 5th, he does the unthinkable in more ways than one. Here was a man so committed to survival. He had the stamina and the tenacity to not only surgically remove his injured foot with cutlery, he also committed an act of self-cannibalism. It is dark now. The glow of the embers provides just enough light to keep me reading, even though I don't want to at this point. Basically, he is starving on every page. After amputating his foot and eating it, just one horrible thing after another in this journal, and it gets worse. Here's what he writes on February 9. I've amputated my left foot and have bandaged it with my pants. Strange. All through the operation, I was drooling, but I made myself wait until dark. Then, I kept telling myself, cold roast beef, cold roast beef. This entry, of course, has me sick to my stomach, and I can't help but think of the picnic lunch which Mrs. T packed for me. I can understand why Homer buried these words on this island. Hoping to get some shut-eye, I've made a little bed. It's very uncomfortable on these rocks. I'm just using my jacket on the smoothest stones I could find. And I'm using the life vest for a pillow. I doubt that I will get any sleep. I keep stealing glances at this journal, wasting my battery on my phone to look at the words. Dr. Pine's writing becomes erratic. He loses track of the days. In this diary, he does find a scant amount of food, a dead fish, a live crab, but by now all the fresh water is gone for him, and I'm really not sure how he is still alive after what seems to be at least a month. Here's a little bit from what is marked February 17. Took off my right leg at the knee, but lost a lot of blood. Pain excruciating in spite of heroin. Shock trauma would have killed a lesser man. Unthinkable acts are on each page. Removing each leg from the knee down isn't enough. He begins to carve somehow into his thighs. And then, this part is the worst. He cuts off and consumes each earlobe. Richard ponders whether or not he has gone insane. And then he turns his attention and his hunger to his most prized possessions, his hands, the invaluable hands of a surgeon, the hands that he had protected and cherished all of his life on the mean streets of New York, on the football field, the hands that brought him out of poverty and onto Park Avenue. Now, those hands in the end are reduced to paltry scraps of meat. The last words on the last page read, "Ladyfingers. They taste just like ladyfingers." You guys know me. I always try to find the bright side, and right now, that is not easy to do. But if I flip back a couple pages, February 12th, the entry reads, "The sun is out again, a beautiful day. It's been a good day for me, as good as any day gets on this island." For me, the sun is not out, but the stars are up above, and now that the embers of my fire are gone, these stars are a wonder. I think I can go to sleep now. I'm awake. It's dawn. It's January, I don't know what, actually 2023. I've buried the journal. I've covered up the remains of Richard Pinzetti. I am standing on the shore, looking at the water. Mrs. T and her sailboat are nowhere in sight. Well, shit.
Thank you for watching and listening to the Stephen King Book Club. I hope you'll join us again very soon.